Here's what most people forget. XRP didn't just rise and fall like a typical crypto. It went through something far more defining, a battle that nearly erased it from relevance, yet somehow made it stronger. And if you don't understand that phase, nothing about the $1,000 conversation will make sense. The moment everything changed. When the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed its lawsuit against Ripple Labs, it wasn't just legal pressure, it was psychological warfare on investors. Exchanges started delisting XRP, fear spread instantly, and what looked like a promising asset suddenly felt radioactive. And for many, that was the end of the story, or so it seemed. But something unusual happened. Instead of disappearing, XRP refused to die. Its community stayed unusually resilient, developers kept building, and behind the scenes, Ripple didn't slow down the way critics expected, and that raises a question most casual observers never asked. Why didn't it collapse completely like so many other projects under less pressure? Now look deeper. This wasn't just about price, it was about positioning. Because while retail investors were reacting emotionally, Ripple was still forming partnerships, still pushing into cross-border payments, still aligning itself with institutions, quietly building in a direction that didn't rely on hype cycles. And here's where the narrative shifts. XRP may not be behaving like a typical cryptocurrency at all, because while most projects chase speculation, XRP has always been tied to something bigger, financial infrastructure. And if that's true, then measuring it like a normal asset might be the first mistake people are making. But this creates a contradiction. If XRP is so deeply connected to institutional systems, why has its price remained relatively suppressed compared to other cryptos that offer far less real-world integration? That gap between utility and price is where curiosity starts turning into suspicion. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because if there's even a small chance that XRP's trajectory is being shaped by forces beyond normal market behavior, then the timeline everyone is expecting could be completely wrong. So now you're not just looking at a crypto anymore, you're looking at a long game, one that may have been unfolding quietly while most people were distracted by short-term moves. And that brings us back to the original claim, because maybe Patrick Bet-David isn't reacting to hype, maybe he's reacting to a pattern. Now here's where things start to connect. Because Patrick Bet-David didn't arrive at this XRP thesis randomly, his argument isn't built on hype, it's built on how money actually moves through the world. And once you follow that trail, the conversation starts shifting from price prediction to something much deeper. The core of his thinking is simple, but dangerous to ignore. Global finance is slow, fragmented, and expensive. Trillions of dollars move across borders every single day, yet the infrastructure behind it still relies on outdated systems. And this inefficiency isn't a minor flaw, it's a massive opportunity waiting for a solution. And that's exactly where XRP enters the conversation. But here's the key detail most people overlook. XRP isn't trying to compete with retail-driven cryptocurrencies. It's targeting banks, institutions, and payment corridors, areas where even a small improvement in speed and cost translates into billions saved. And if a system like that gains traction, the demand dynamics change completely. Now follow the logic carefully. If XRP becomes a bridge asset for cross-border liquidity, its value wouldn't just be based on speculation, it would be tied to actual usage, meaning the more money flows through the network, the more pressure builds on the price. Not overnight, but structurally over time. And this is where his argument becomes controversial, because for XRP to reach extreme valuations, it wouldn't need retail hype. It would need deep integration into global financial systems. I mean, that's a much slower, quieter process, one that happens behind closed doors, not on social media timelines. But let's introduce some friction here. Critics argue that this vision assumes near-perfect adoption, that banks would have to agree, regulators would need clarity, and competitors would have to fall behind. And historically, systems this large don't change easily, which makes the 1,000 narrative feel like a stretch, yet the counterpoint is just as strong. Financial systems don't evolve gradually forever. They shift in phases. And when a more efficient system reaches a tipping point, adoption can accelerate faster than expected. Not because everyone agrees, but because the cost of staying behind becomes too high. So now you're stuck between two realities. One says XRP is overhyped and mathematically unrealistic. The other suggests it's early, misunderstood, and potentially positioned for something much bigger than most people realize. And right in the middle of that tension sits the most important question of all. Does the math actually support this kind of move, or does it quietly destroy the entire argument? Now comes the part most people avoid. because once you step into the numbers, emotion disappears. And suddenly the $1,000 XRP narrative is forced to face something far less forgiving: mathematics. And this is exactly where believers and critics collide the hardest. Let's address the obvious first. For XRP to reach $1,000, its total valuation would explode into levels that seem almost unimaginable compared to today. We're not talking about billions, we're talking about a scale that starts competing with the largest financial systems on the planet. And for many analysts, that alone is enough to shut the conversation down instantly. And this is where skepticism becomes valid. Critics argue that even if XRP succeeds, expecting it to absorb that much value assumes a level of dominance that no single digital asset has ever achieved. Not even Bitcoin, at its peak influence, has reached anything close to that kind of global financial absorption, which makes the $1,000 claim feel less like a projection and more like an exaggeration. But here's where the argument takes a sharp turn. Because comparing XRP to traditional market cap models might be the wrong framework entirely. And this is the exact point supporters lean on. They claim XRP isn't meant to store value like other assets. It's meant to move value. And that distinction changes how you interpret the numbers completely. Now think carefully about this shift. If XRP is used as a bridge for liquidity, the same unit of XRP could theoretically facilitate massive volumes of transactions repeatedly, meaning its utility isn't tied to static valuation alone, but to velocity, how often it's used, how much value flows through it, and how critical it becomes to the system. And suddenly, the math gets complicated, because now you're not just calculating price based on supply and demand, you're factoring in global transaction volume, institutional reliance, and liquidity efficiency, variables that don't behave like typical crypto speculation models. But let's not ignore the pushback. Even with this alternative perspective, critics argue that the leap from utility to $1,000 price still requires assumptions that haven't been proven: widespread adoption, regulatory alignment, and a near-perfect execution scenario. And without those, the numbers start collapsing again under their own weight. And this is where the tension peaks, because both sides are using logic, one grounded in traditional valuation models, the other in a future where financial infrastructure itself evolves. And the truth is, neither side has complete certainty. Unless there's something happening behind the scenes that hasn't fully surfaced yet, because if there are catalysts developing quietly, agreements, integrations, or systemic shifts, then the numbers people are using today might be based on an outdated version of reality. And if that's true, then the real story isn't the price. It's the timing of when the world realizes what's already been building. Now this is where the conversation shifts from numbers to power, because if XRP's future isn't purely driven by market forces, then something else must be influencing its trajectory, something slower, quieter, and far more strategic than most people are paying attention to. Start with the global direction of money. Governments and central banks are actively exploring digital currencies, not as speculation, but as infrastructure. And this is where the idea of central bank digital currency enters the picture, a system designed to digitize national currencies while maintaining control. And that shift alone could redefine how value moves across borders. But here's the uncomfortable overlap. XRP, through Ripple Labs, has already positioned itself in conversations around cross-border efficiency, not hypothetically, but through real partnerships and pilot programs. And while none of this guarantees dominance, it places XRP in rooms where most cryptocurrencies never even get invited. Now connect those dots carefully. If CBDCs handle domestic control and something like XRP handles cross-border liquidity, you start to see a layered financial system forming, one where different technologies serve different roles. And XRP's role, if realized, wouldn't be optional, it would be functional. And this is where the theory becomes controversial. Some believe XRP has been intentionally moving through a slower, controlled timeline, not suppressed but managed, allowing regulatory clarity, institutional comfort, and infrastructure readiness to develop before any major price reflection occurs. And while this idea lacks hard proof, it explains something critics struggle with: the gap between XRP's utility narrative and its market behavior. But let's keep this grounded. There's a difference between possibility and confirmation. Partnerships don't equal mass adoption. Pilot programs don't guarantee global integration, and speculation doesn't replace execution, which means betting entirely on this theory without evidence would be reckless. Yet ignoring it completely might be just as dangerous, because financial history has shown that the biggest shifts often happen quietly before they become obvious. And by the time clarity arrives, the opportunity is no longer asymmetric. It's already priced in. So now the pressure shifts to you, not to blindly believe, not to blindly reject, but to recognize that if XRP is even partially aligned with these structural changes, then timing becomes everything, not just if it happens, but when you understand that it's happening. And that leads to the final and most important phase of this entire conversation. Because at some point, analysis has to turn into a decision.